What do you think is the most famous part of the Bible? Is it John 3:16, for God so loved the world? Is it the story of creation and the Garden of Eden? What about Noah's Ark and the story of the flood, or Jonah and the giant fish? Maybe Daniel and the lion's den? Is it the shortest verse in the Bible, Jesus wept? What about the story of Jesus' death on the cross? Which part of the Bible do you think is the most famous? Which part of Scripture is the most well known by Christians and non-Christians alike? There's so many famous lines in the Bible. There's so many famous characters and stories in the pages of Scripture, and honestly, it would be difficult to pick one line or one story as the most famous, because so much of the Bible is well known around the world. No other book, no other religious document has had the impact on the world the way the Bible has. And there are certain sections of Scripture that stick out as particularly impactful, particularly powerful. Now, don't get me wrong, all of Scripture is important. All of Scripture is powerful and impactful, but some passages just stand above the rest. Colossians 3, Romans 8, 1 Corinthians 13, Deuteronomy 6, Genesis 1, to name a few. One of my favorite passages, and one of the most famous in the whole Bible, is Psalm 23. Now, maybe you're already familiar with this psalm. Maybe you've never heard it before. Maybe the name sounds familiar, but you can't remember the details. Let's read it together. It goes like this. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters, and he restores my soul. He guides me along paths of righteousness for his name's sake, and even when I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for I know that you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table for me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil, and my cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. This psalm, these words, have had a huge impact on me over the last 3 or 4 years. You see, I was in one of my first Bible classes in college, and my professor would read us a psalm before the start of every class. Now, this professor was one of those teachers who would randomly go off on a tangent, and you'd end up hearing disconnected story after disconnected story for 20 or 30 minutes. So as a class, we never really knew if we'd end up covering the material for that day, or if we'd end up hearing a few random stories from our professor's life. Now I tell you that because I can still remember the day our professor read Psalm 23. I grew up in church, and the words were familiar to me, but I thought that's all they were, just words. But I'll never forget my professor reading these words to a classroom of about 50 people, and about the time she started reading the 4th verse, she had started to cry. She cried her way through the rest of the psalm, took a deep breath, and started to tell us a story. Except this wasn't one of those random crazy lady stories we'd come to expect. As our professor started talking, she told us the story of her abuse as a little girl. She recounted the story of her decades-long sexual abuse at the hands of a close family member. And as she told the story, with tears in her eyes, she told us that around the same time that she was first abused, a Sunday school teacher encouraged her to memorize the 23rd Psalm. And she shared with us that for years, she would say the words of Psalm 23 to herself while her abuser took advantage of her. She shared with us that the words of Psalm 23 were the only thing that stopped her from giving up hope. That the words of Psalm 23 were the only thing that got her through that horrible time in her life. She shared that every time she reads the psalm, in private or in public, she can't help but cry at the memory not of her abuse, but of God's love for her and how he rescued her from the trauma of her past. I remember sitting in class overcome by emotions and thinking to myself, I've never experienced the Bible like that before. I realized until then I'd only thought of the Bible as words on a page, as a self-help manual. And I realized that day that the Scriptures, they have power, that the words of God are alive and sharper than a double-edged sword. I realized that day that the Bible isn't a book of nice words or answers to questions. It's a book about love and action. And God is still working through those words today. There's so many incredible passages in the Bible, but none of them have had as big an impact on me as Psalm 23. Which leads me to our main point, our big idea. If you don't remember anything else, remember this. Psalm 23 is a picture of life in Jesus' kingdom. Psalm 23 isn't just a pretty poem or a nice saying to put on a sign at Hobby Lobby. Psalm 23 isn't trying to make us feel good or think that's nice. It's not quaint and calm. It's a picture of life in Jesus' kingdom. It describes a version of life that's available to you and to me when we choose to live with Jesus. When we choose to live with Jesus, we lack nothing. When we choose to live with Jesus, our soul is refreshed and we're guided along the paths of righteousness. This doesn't mean that everything's going to go perfectly. It doesn't mean we'll always be out of harm's way, that we'll never experience danger or darkness. Quite the opposite. But when we walk through the valley of the shadow of death, we never need to be afraid because Jesus is with us. We never walk alone, not for a single step. And when we come out the other side of the dark valley, we find a feast set up for us. We are overcome by Jesus' blessings of love and mercy in our life. We dwell with him. The words of Psalm 23 aren't supposed to be spiritual or mystical or metaphorical. They're describing life in Jesus' kingdom, life that's available to each and every one of us. So let me ask you a question. Does that sound like your life? Do you lack nothing? Is your soul being refreshed by being with Jesus? When life is hard and you're walking through the darkest valley, are you calm and confident in the presence of Jesus always with you? Are you enjoying a feast in the presence of your enemies? Is your life overflowing with goodness and mercy because of Jesus' blessing over you? Does Psalm 23 describe your life? Remember, no one's saying that life in Jesus' kingdom isn't going to be hard. No one's saying that it won't be messy and difficult, that there won't be days, weeks, months, years even where you're depressed or anxious or overcome. But it could be true. It could be true that even in our depression, even in our anxiety, even in our darkness, we could experience a Psalm 23 life. A life in Jesus' kingdom. A life where his presence alone is all we could ever need. A life where with the psalmist we can say, Lord, you are my shepherd. I lack nothing. Now, as this video comes to an end, we're going to move into our SELAH time. And if you're watching this in person, then your small group leader is going to give you a SELAH card. And it has all the directions you need for engaging in this time. And remember, this isn't a time to check your phone, worry about the people around you, laugh, giggle, or try to get someone else's attention. My hope is that you'll use this time to experience the words of Psalm 23 as more than just words, but as a picture of life in Jesus' kingdom. I'm going to turn it over to Nick and Spencer. I hope you have a powerful SELAH time. I'll see you guys next week.